Nicole, can you tell, is the video going?
It isn't. You and I are live on social media. That's what I was thinking. Maybe since the video is not playing, maybe we could just start sharing because we have about 11 people who are watching.
Absolutely. So, please introduce yourself and then I will introduce myself. People know us from the different ways in which Latinx Education Collaborative partners with a variety of organizations, yours being one, mine being another. So please introduce yourself and I'll come in.
Yeah, thank you. I am Nicole Price, and every once in a while I get to lead a leadership development company called Lively Paradox, and we focus on helping people to help difference get along. And it sounds so simple, yet not always so easy. And I'm excited today to be talking about internalized racial oppression. So thanks for having me.
Everyone's here now. Katina, are you ready to move forward as our mediator?
I am. Good evening,
Okay.
good evening, good evening, everyone. My name is Katina Taylor. I am the founder of Elements of Education Kansas City, also the principal of Dreams Consulting. And I am so excited to be with you this evening and serve as the moderator for Internalized Oppression, when hate comes from inside. This is a dialogue, a precursor to a more in-depth workshop designed for BIPOC people. And I'm even going to start with the basics. You know, we have to understand what we mean when we say BIPOC. So Black, Indigenous, people of color, meaning anyone who is not white. And so we've got to have a conversation centered around oppression, internalized racial oppression, that basically stems from our existence and participation in the society in which we find ourselves. And so our resident experts, as you have already met, Dr. Nicole D. Price of the Lively Paradox and Cecilia Belser-Patton of Just Systems. But we have another speaker for the evening, and that's Edgar Palacios of the Latinx Education Collaborative. So Edgar, go ahead and introduce yourself to the folks, let them know what you do and why you're excited to be a part of this conversation this evening.
Thank you, Katina, for that opportunity. And first of all, it's always a pleasure being in community with Dr. Price and Cecilia and you, Katina. I'm Edgar Palacios. I'm the founder of the Latinx Education Collaborative, and we work on increasing the representation of Latinx educators in K-12. We are also excited to serve as the host for this work moving forward. And so just excited to be in partnership to learn what we can be doing to do the internal work that it takes in order for us to address issues as white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and so forth. So excited to be here and excited to maybe contribute just a little bit, but also here to learn.
Thank you so much, Edgar. I appreciate it. I want to start off by sharing some words I believe that were written by Dr. Price. And this will just kind of set the tone for our conversation this evening. As BIPOC people, we have been targeted, discriminated against, and oppressed for centuries in the United States. We often internalize the myths and misinformation that society communicated to us about ourselves. This shows up in our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with others in the same cultural group, as well as others from different backgrounds than ours. When we internalize these untruths, it causes us to feel that in some way we are inherently not as worthy, capable, intelligent, beautiful, and or good as others. We turn our experience of oppression inward, often acting out the stereotypes and bad information that we've been told as truth. It is important for the BIPOC community to realize that internalized oppression isn't our fault. No one should be blamed or blame themselves for the effects of discrimination, bias, oppression, or racism. That we can interrupt the process of internalized oppression. So I needed to read that. I needed to hear that. I needed to be reminded of that. And I am sure that while this conversation may be uncomfortable for some, it is essential that we have it because we often will show up in ways that mimic, look like, further support, or move forward white supremacist culture and ideology. So with that being said, Dr. Price, these were your words. Tell me what you were thinking about, or an experience perhaps that you have had where you have actually shown up in space and acted from your place of internalized racial oppression.
I was hoping that you were going to start there, because I love to talk about how I get these things wrong. I think there's so much more to learn about from my failures than there could ever be from the things I get right. And I just by nature am a person who could learn in the education system as it was designed. My personality is such that white people find me to be palatable in general. And so as I matriculated through elementary school, middle school, high school, college, when I started to work in business and industry, you know, the fact that I smile all the time and I smile, I mean, you know, just these things that are just kind of inherent in my disposition granted me privilege. And from that lens, I was believing that other people who did not have opportunity and access, that it was somehow because maybe they didn't try hard enough. They didn't work hard enough, that because I had overcome poverty and familial dysfunction and, you know, lots of trauma things, I assume that everyone should be able to work outside and around these systems. And again, looking at individuals and saying, well, if they would just eat healthier, if they would just spend less, or if they would just be less contentious, or if they would smile more, or, you know, be more emotional intelligent, maybe they could have the same thing. And in that regard, I was perpetuating the myth that there's something inherently wrong with Black people. And I'm not sure what the catalyst or the turning point was necessarily, but I tell the story about fleas, and I know many of you have heard me tell it. If you put fleas in a glass, they all jump out, right? But if you put fleas in a glass and you put a lid on that glass, they jump up and hit their bodies against that lid till they realize it hurts. And then they start to jump just below the lid. And you can take the lid off and those fleas will continually jump just below the lid, even though there's no lid there. And there are people who would say, well, obstacles are gone, so why don't you just jump? And the phenomenon is called learned helplessness. I know you all know that. But our United States way of looking at this, even though this is a global issue, because we're such individualists, we think that, well, if you work hard to flee, you can jump up and grab the little lid and get your body out of there, no matter what. And we continue to look at the fleas when the issue is the glass and the lid. And I think for me, as much as we can get everyone to look at the glass and the lid, the people who have been inside these systems, as well as the people who are outside these systems, I think the better we'll all be. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price. I want to hand it over to Edgar. And Edgar, my question for you is, oftentimes, you know, when we start talking about the Latinx community or the Asian American AAPI community and things of that nature, we have a lot of shared similarities, but we often sit in our differences, right? And so we hear those terms about model majority or assimilation or getting, you know, closeness to whiteness and that types of things. So we know that this internalized racial oppression, it exists in all of us. Can you talk about your experience and when you've recognized that it's shown up for you, and how perhaps you have had to be intentional and consistent about breaking that cycle?
Thanks, Katina, for that opportunity. And so I think about it from there's a narrative in my community, and one that I have often subscribed to, around this idea around exceptionalism. And this idea that like, I'm the first to do this, right? And so sometimes you hear that narrative, I'm the first to graduate high school, or I'm the first to go to college, or I'm the first to do this. And that narrative can help build this idea that something about you is special, versus acknowledge the environment that you're in, or and acknowledge certain things that had nothing to do with you as a human being or a person, but it acknowledges everything that was around you and this is systems of support. And so I've had to struggle with that, you know. I think from that perspective of like the reminder that I belong to a community of firsts, right? I'm not the first Latino ever to graduate college. I'm not the first Latino to graduate high school. I'm not the first Latino to, you know, have parents who are immigrants. Maybe in my context I am, but I am part of a larger community of folks who are doing this. And so reminding ourselves about the power of community and that we belong to something larger is important. I think also as we tackle differences within communities, it's always important to remember that white supremacy is the enemy, you know. And I think the challenge sometimes there is that we, between Black and Brown and other people of color communities, the system is designed for us to combat and for us to go against each other and for us to believe that there's limited resources and for us to buy into these long held narratives around power and whatnot. And so it is the internal work that is important in this, and it's the internal work that you have to do to combat those narratives. And it's the reminder that like we're not perfect in this, right? Like we are consistently learning and growing from this work. That's important to me. And I had another narrative that I was going to share. Oh, the narrative of assimilation. And that's something that I struggled with firsthand. I didn't know that I was assimilating when it was happening. You know, I wasn't conscious of assimilation. It's not something that you choose to do, although sometimes it can be, I think. But I'll share a quick story. In Spokane, Washington, when I moved away from Miami, Florida is its own country to a certain extent, right? It has its own flavor, its own way of operating. And then you remove me from that experience and you move me to Spokane, Washington, where there is very little diversity in terms of people of color. I was afraid of speaking Spanish out loud. I told my parents often to, you know, just not even to communicate in grocery stores. You know, I was terrified of standing out or being different. And so, you know, I think about assimilation as this false choice around like, do you fit in or do you not? And this idea that you're going to be safe if you fit in and you're not going to be safe or if you don't. And the reality is and I could be wrong on this, but if you're not white, you know, sometimes you're not going to be safe regardless if you fit in or not. And I think that that's a stark truth that people have to realize. And I think that that's a painful truth that people have to realize. But that's where the work comes from. And so a lot of narratives within our community, a reminder that for me, it's always good to remember that white supremacy is the enemy. And so when working with other folks or we're disagreeing or when having differences of opinion, that we don't start attacking each other as Black and Brown folks, but to think about like how white supremacy is informing our decisions in the way that we're operating in community.
Thank you so much for that, Edgar. And I want to jump to Cecilia. Cecilia, I know you well. And I often find that you have a very uncanny ability to recognize this internalized racial oppression that exists in all of us, even yourself, I'm sure at times. Where does that come from? Where did you kind of sharpen your skill set to be able to identify those things and then tactfully but powerfully call them out so that we can begin to dismantle them in ourselves and in our brothers and sisters so we don't continue to be oppressive to one another?
Well, that's a good question, Katina. I wasn't expecting that, but thank you for that question. You know, one of the things I know is that we all struggle with it because we've been socialized to. So as Dr. Price was talking about the fleas only jumping to the perimeter of the rim, right? And not jumping beyond that. we have all been socialized to center whiteness and to center whatever makes us proximate to that. And as a person who grew up in those communities, I grew up in Raytown and Lee Summit before Raytown and Lee Summit looks like they do today. And so what I'm very aware of is how, as I was navigating that space, we moved out south when I was in the 3rd grade. And so southeast. And so when I was navigating those spaces, I recognized what people found acceptable and amenable about me, and how I was treated differently than other peers that came in that were starting to matriculate to the suburbs after my family did. And so I recognize my ability to code switch. I have gift of language. I've always had that. And so my ability to be able to do that, my ability to be able to be what white people like. And so I recognize when we are, I feel in myself when I'm not being authentic, or when I'm not utilizing my ability to code switch by choice when it comes in as a default. And when I started to recognize that, I decided that is not something that I wanted to do. And it was a process. And I can tell you when that process started for me. I was an English major at the University of Oklahoma, and I was the only Black English major. In my first year, I had all white professors. In my second year, a woman who has been so influential in my life because she saw me and advocated for me to be my authentic self. I get really emotional about Dr. Fontenot because she really saved my life in a lot of ways. Being in those spaces and starting to take her classes that she was offering, as well as the classics, and reading Linden Hills by Gloria Naylor, and recognizing myself. Linden Hills is a novel that Gloria Naylor wrote after Women of Brewster Place that was a parallel to the Chicago ghettos in Southside Chicago of Women of Brewster Place. It was a novel about an affluent family in Linden Hills, and how one of the protagonists, the daughter, kept trying to commit suicide by jumping into their empty pool that they had in their very middle class, upper middle class home, because the mother and father wanted to say that they had a pool, but they were afraid to swim and didn't teach their children how to swim. And how this young girl, as she was going through this process of trying to find herself, she kept trying to jump into the empty pool. And I was able to see myself in her. I was able to see what happens when we continue to not move in our authentic selves, when we continue to only proximate ourselves next to whiteness, because, as Edgar says, we're trying to be exceptional, because we feel as if we're the only one, because this is the way we're moving in ascension. All the different ways in which we have gaslit ourselves around why we should do that, because we've been socialized that way even before we exited the womb, right? And so because of that, and seeing that in myself, seeing that in my brother, and seeing that not for other people, seeing that in my immediate feeling with my mother and father, but also seeing spaces where their family wasn't able to slide through the cracks like they did, right? And recognizing this has to be something about not just us. This has to be something bigger that decides that it's okay for Edgar, Nicole, Cecilia to slide through the cracks, but then perhaps their families don't. Perhaps their friends in their neighborhoods don't. And so because of that, I started really studying critical race theory, looking at what it makes us do, looking at all of these different things. And more importantly, I think it made me want to interrupt that.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. So we're having this conversation around internalized racial oppression. Sometimes people use different terms to describe this. So I think it's really important for us to actually have the definitions for our audience and people that will come back later to actually view this broadcast, right? So internalized racist oppression is defined as a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches all people to believe, accept, and live out delusional, positive, or superior, and negative or inferior societal definitions of self and to fit into and live out societal roles. These behaviors support and maintain the construct of race. So that is the definition from what we're working from. And I think it's extremely important for people to understand, just like we had to for a while consistently talk about the definition of racism. We have to know what we're talking about when we start talking about internalized racial oppression, how we show up and then perpetuate oppressive behaviors. So the goal is to dismantle, disrupt, do away with those notions. And that means being intentional and consistent. So, how are each of you in your lives and in your work being consistent and intentional about dismantling and disrupting internalized racial oppression? Whoever would like to go first. Dr. Price?
Yeah, I'll take it. One of my favorite authors in the work is Ta-Nehisi Coates. And in his most popular book, I think Between the World and Me is his most popular book. I might be misstating there, but he talks about how he tells his son, don't do all that bending and twisting and turning because it ain't gonna help no way. And I remember when I was terminated from a job in an executive role, when I was single-handedly bringing in most of the business beyond the founder. And when I realized that all that bending and twisting and turning wasn't going to help no way, I made a conscious decision that I was going to stop. And much like Cecilia, it's a process. But one thing that I do is the way I talk is the way I talk. And I'm not going to adjust the way I talk. This is how I talk. When I'm talking to Black people, I'm not going to put any kind of hot sauce on it to make it different. And when I'm talking to white people, I'm not going to put raisins in the potato salad to make it different. I'm not going to, because it doesn't help anyway. And there's something very freeing about it. The way it shows up in my business is, in general, white people do not like to be shut down, especially when they're engaging in what I call mental gymnastics, when they're trying to give you the benefit, let's be the devil's advocate and think about these exceptions of the rule. The way in which, in some ways, I think it was Cecilia said it, those of us who slide through the cracks, right? I don't make space for that in my sessions, not about race. And I don't make space for that in my sessions about, honestly, any numerically marginalized group. And I will often get a call that says, Nicole, we felt like you were a little harsh when you shut down that discussion. And I've learned how to receive it, but I actually push back and I say, I want you to go back and watch the video. And I want you to imagine, if I were a white woman, would you characterize my language, my approach, the words I said as harsh? And I really want to know, because to me, what I would have done in the past was say, okay, you're right. Let me be more emotionally intelligent. Let me make space for everybody to speak. And, trying to create equity and voice. When, if you're trying to have a discussion about inclusion, equity and voice means that those of you who are in social power don't get to speak as much, that sometimes you have to be silent. And the facilitator cannot make space for you to cause harm with your language. And so when I see it happening based on my experience, I am going to respectfully say, we're actually not doing that right now. We're talking about social power structures. When you want to talk about individual prejudice or discrimination, we'll have a time for that. But for now, we're talking about social power structures. And I'm going to say it just like that. I'm not calling anybody back later to apologize for saying that. And I recognize that it will likely cost me business. And I'm okay with that because at some point we have to acknowledge all that twisting and turning and bending ain't going to help no way.
Thank you so much. Edgar?
You know, I've been wrestling with some questions recently in terms of, I think a lot about expertise in DEI work and what that means. Is lived experience enough? You know, like, are people reading critical race theory kind of stuff and like learning about it and bettering and improving their stuff? You know, and my question, I actually have a question, Katina, that I want to pose because I think it's important. You know, we all operate within white supremacy constructs. And so I'm curious, like, sometimes we operate in these spaces and we don't know that we're upholding white supremacist ideals. Like, you know, I think about my responsibility as a leader and my responsibility to an organization, my responsibility to certain things. And I'm like, am I power hoarding? Am I not power hoarding? Am I gatekeeping? Am I not gatekeeping? You know, if I want to be punctual, am I upholding like colonial standards of whatever, or am I not? You know, I think about, what does excellence mean, right? Like, is excellence based in perfectionism, or is it not? And you know, so my question is like, how do we know when we're actually operating in space of white supremacist culture? And how do you define that? So those are some questions that I've been wrestling with.
I'm
Am I?
I would
I'm
love for
going,
Cecilia to speak to that, Dr. Price, and then I would love for you to piggyback on that.
I have a
Because I
question too.
too struggle. Yeah, I struggle with that as well, and so I try to keep the characteristics of white supremacy, you know, at top of mind. And I think my answer to that would be, um, it's based on how people feel and what the impact is in the time that we're exercising that. But Cecilia, go ahead. You're the expert. I yield to you. How do we know when we are operating from our place of internalized racial oppression or inferiority?
I think what we must understand, in the same ways that we want our white brothers and sisters to understand that they're always operating from a space of superiority, even if it's passively and benefiting from that. If we're not careful, we're always operating from a space of inferiority because that's what we've been taught to do. That does not mean it shows up all the time in us not feeling good about ourselves. It does not mean it shows us up in us having low self-esteem. That's not the case. And I think it is always at work where we must be questioning at all the time until there's something that we've mastered in interrupting around those constructs, that we make sure that we're asking the question. Edgar and I have this conversation all the time because Edgar is in the season of Latinx Education Collaborative, mushrooming, growing, moving forward after hard work that has been put into that. And are there aspects where people can perceive that to be all that it is, that it's power hoarding or that it's gatekeeping or that it's these things? I think we always have to be asking ourselves these questions, and making sure we continue to deduce our answers to make sure we're telling the truth and to make sure that we're trying to move forward in a manner that is collaborative, that is about community, that is about relationship. I'm not good at that sometimes because one of the things I know that I've been able to master is white supremacy constructs, to my detriment and to my benefit, right? And so the things that I've become good at is interrupting the perfectionism. I do interrupt that. I struggle a bit with power hoarding. I struggle a bit with, because I feel like, ooh, I've had this conversation with, I think, all the three of you all on this call. I did this stuff for free for a real long time. And so then now I have to make sure as opportunities open that I share those. I try to be intentional about it, even when my stomach hurts, that I say, hey, here's this opportunity, because I ultimately believe in a space where everyone has enough. I'm trying to move away from a space of scarcity because that's where that comes from, right? And recognizing that all of us can show up in ways around equity, Diversity. I'm not a diversity person. I'm not a DEI person. I'm very clear about the fact that I'm a ready and a jetty person, which means I'm justice oriented. Nicole would say, I'm a weed puller. And that is my natural orientation. Like, I'm trying to move towards justice. You know, slave plantations were diverse. Like, we need to come on and talk about it. We've been in diversity for a real long time, right? And so I think that we have to always be doing what Edgar does, which is always within that self-discovery and that unearthing of self, asking ourselves, what are we operating from pure authenticity? And are we operating in spaces where we're trying to collaborate and create community where all can do well?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Dr.
That's
Price,
not
I
to
know
mean that I do that all the time, though. It's mean I'm
right,
aware of when I don't, and I come back and try to repair that harm.
because you're not seeking perfection, which we
No.
know is a characteristic of white supremacy,
Yeah.
or notion of, and is perhaps placed upon others when it's not placed upon them. But I digress. Dr. Price, go ahead.
Well, Cecilia, you know, I love the weed puller. You know that I believe full-heartedly that we need weed pullers to make the garden whole. Like, if otherwise, weeds take over. I think for me, where I sometimes get stuck is because I too have, and I don't know if I perfected adjusting to white supremacy culture, but I got it pretty damn well so that I can, that I can be successful in it. And with that, I recognize that most white people don't want to do the work, consciously or unconsciously, or are not ready for the work, because in 2021, I still have people saying, I just want to see people as people. I don't see color. Y'all, today, do you hear me? Today, listen, today. And so what I have done is said, well, let me have a remedial course of such. I don't call it that, but let me have a remedial course so that when they show up in a Cecilia's course, they're ready. But I got to tell you that sometimes when I'm in the remedial course, talking about difference and inclusivity and how to listen and empathy, I feel like, wait, am I centering whiteness? Because that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to make white people comfortable so that they can hear the justice content. And I just got to tell you, if people can't see this battle that I'm in internally, trying to figure out, should I be doing this, or should I be preparing more Black and brown people to fight against these systems? And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is.
Thank you for that vulnerability. Go ahead, Cecilia.
I think we need all of it. Like, and I do the same thing, Dr. Price. Like, in one of the organizations I'm affiliated with, I do very intro level defining racism and defining space there, right? And what are next steps? Cecilia shows up authentically there and also differently there than in other spaces, right? I also, even in that space though, really try to orient people to recognize I'm wanting you to organize yourself to be moving to those next levels. When I'm clear about that thing that you're talking about, and that is the reason why I so very much wanted.
Uh-oh, Cecilia, we've lost your sound.
She was speaking too much truth, and so the system just shut her down.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I have been also thinking about what Dr. Price was talking about of, should we be preparing ourselves? And that is the reason why I have been talking with Edgar about, we got to talk about internal racialized inferiority. We got to talk about internal racialized oppression and what it does to us and how it interrupts our ability to build relationship with one another, to collaborate with one another. Because what I'm clear about is that we have to come together in community in order to have sustenance for doing this work, but also to combat that other stuff when we are gaslighting ourselves saying, am I centering whiteness here? No, Dr. Price, you're teaching. You're a teacher, you're a facilitator, you're doing your job. That is
Are
not,
you meeting your students where they are, perhaps?
you're meeting the needs of where the students are, right? And so, do we want our students to grow? Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we have to share with folks when they're saying, I don't see color, I don't see this. That is them. That same thing of code switching and not operating out of their authenticity. I would rather that folks just say, I don't want to give up my power, Cecilia, because I get it. If the world had been colonized by Africans and the norm was our beauty with this hair, I don't know if I'd want to give it up either. I would hopefully would move through it, but I don't know. So I want us to get to that place where we can have those types of conversations. And so, yeah, we got to talk over there. We have to talk over here. And at some point, we have to try to come to the middle for all of us.
Thank you, Cecilia. So another term that has come up is internalized racist inferiority. And another term that is really popular right now is imposter syndrome. So I want to first read the definition of the internalized racist inferiority. Now, understand, for those of you that are listening in and maybe hearing these definitions for the first time, that these are all complex, multi-generational processes of socialization. So you'll hear that at the beginning, right? But so this one says a complex, multi-generational socialization process. What does it teach? It teaches people of color to believe, accept, and live out inferior societal definitions of self and to fit into and live out inferior societal roles. These behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, which is white supremacy culture. So when I think about this internalized racist inferiority, and then I hear this term about imposter syndrome, are we just giving the internalized racist inferiority a different name? Are they one and the same? But we dress it up so that we don't feel as bad about it, or we don't realize that we have to work against the socialization process that has got us to feel like we don't belong, or we're not good enough, or we're constantly inferior. That's why we get the PhDs, the JDs, and all of the stuff to prove ourselves. What say you all about that?
I think I want to take the first question. So when we're thinking about what it looks like to go into spaces, one thing that I'm regularly concerned about is that right now, when we're in this progressive state, you know, like I feel like right now we're in a progressive state. Mr. Floyd's murder kind of pushed people into wanting to do this work. And in this progressive state, folks will go out and hire the most weed pullingest of weed pullers to work inside a system. And I think that is a setup for failure for both the institution and for the person. If you're a true weed puller, you just don't even have the temperament. You work outside systems to tear down and rebuild something else. So going inside a system as a weed puller is going to cause you to have to adjust, or else the system will push you out. But in that same regard, those people who I describe as the tillers, the ones who adjust their style to be more palatable, to make space for people later. Edgar, they are gatekeepers, but gatekeepers in the way that they make space for you later, that they're like, let me be here so that I can make more space for more people more often. What I worry about with them is even in these progressive states, once they get these opportunities, they sometimes forget why they got there. Like the reason you were there, the ultimate goal is to work the system from inside. You have the temperament to do that. Don't become the system. And then the people like me, I feel like I'm a planter. I'm neither of the two. I shift and move based on what the scenario calls itself. But I just kind of like to reap the harvest and everybody to be happy. And the danger in that space is people are not happy when you're trying to force them to see how they're complicit in their own oppression, one, or how they are oppressive, even if they're not doing anything at all besides smiling and being nice. And it's disruptive to people. People don't like disruption, but I don't know how you fix this thing without disruption. It's the agitation in the washer that gets the clothes clean, as my friend Marvin would say. And I don't know. I think I answered your question. I think I'm really concerned about weed pullers going into spaces inside institutions to work. I think we should stick more to community organizing on the outside to be more effective. But feel free to push on me if that idea is not.
No, I thank you so much. That may be a life-saving word for those of us who are listening, and you heard me say us, who are weed pullers. Because we often will begin to question or ask, why am I so frustrated? Why is this journey so difficult? Why do I feel like I'm always being pushed aside? But it's because you don't belong in that space anyway. And you haven't had a Dr. Nicole Price to say, maybe think about it this way, and this is why. It's for your own preservation, and so you can do the real work of dismantling. Edgar, I want to throw it to you, that same question about imposter syndrome versus this internalized racist inferiority. Is that one and the same, or is it not?
So binary options are a part of white supremacist thinking and culture. And so I think something that's important here, it's like it can be an and it can be an either or it could be no, right? I think part of the work, again, like we're fighting against systemic issues, which means a linear solution is not going to work. Dr. Price, you're an engineer. Tell me if I'm wrong on that.
You're right on that. We got to attack it from all the different angles. Yeah.
And I think for me, I have to question, like, what can I do? Right. I can only control my actions, and I can only work on myself. Right. And I can try to define myself as a weed puller or as a planter or in these things. And in the end of the day, like, none of those may fit me. Right. Because it limits me to act in a certain way, depending on the situation. And the reality is, like, this stuff is situational. And so often, like, we all have a capacity to act in a certain way. There are spaces in my life where I'm definitely a weed puller. And there is spaces in my life where I'm a planter. And there's spaces in my life where I'm the tiller. And I think, like, I can be all three all at the same time, or I can be none of the three. And, like, there may be options where it's over the three, or there may be options like I don't even fit in that framework, right? And so, I think it's one of those things where, like, we have to be very careful around, how we start defining ourselves, because sometimes we limit ourselves, and we, it's a categorization, right? It's this individualization of who we are versus, like, I can be many things all at once. And so I can be the oppressor and the oppressed all in the same minute. Right. And, like, so that's what I've been thinking about. I question, like, part of this is feedback. Honestly, part of this is feedback, right? Like, I'm going to call Dr. Price in a couple of days, and I'm going to be like, yo, I need some serious feedback about what's going on here. And she's going to be honest with me. And I trust her to be honest with me. And I'm going to make a decision based on that. But I also have to be receptive to that feedback. And I think it's really hard because, again, defensiveness is also something that we are taught to do. We're taught to be defensive. And so that's the thing. Like, it's hard to, like, navigate these environments because, like, we're operating in white supremacy systems and constructs, and then we're also asking ourselves to not operate under the same functions that we're operated in. And so it's a paradox at the very least. It's a lively paradox. But there's no like, you know, we got to be very careful, like how we start defining ourselves, because all we're doing is recategorizing ourselves into like other people's belief systems and ideas and whatnot. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think if it gives you language to be who you are, then that's fantastic. I also think, like, you know, today I may not have the energy to be a weed puller. Like, this is work. This is community work. This isn't me like being everything all at once. Like, you know what, Cecilia, you might need to handle this today. I'm out. Like, I need to keep my energy. I have other ideas. I want to live a life too. I am worthy of happiness, and I'm worthy of joy, and I'm worthy of all these other things. And so sometimes, like, being surrounded by people who don't believe in my existence, or don't care about my existence, or don't care about my issues, like, that's damaging too.
Yeah. I
So
shared that Tuesday when the one of the reporters from KCUR asked for my comment about, was I or others going to organize an action? And I said, no, I'm going to heal. And we ought to be able to heal. Like, we don't always have to be fighting, and that we should be able to have space to do whatever we need to do for ourselves in this space. So yes, all of what you just said, Edgar, yes.
Well, it's a privilege that's not afforded to us. This idea that we have to work constantly and never stop, that's also something that's internalized and it has been pushed on us. You know, white people rest.
Yep.
A lot.
They
A
take
lot.
when you're talking about race and racism, they take breaks from race and racism more than I can even imagine. You know, people move to entire states where they don't have to have racialized spaces, right? Like
Vermont, New Hampshire,
Utah, like, let me move to a state where I don't even have to see you, so I don't even have to think about this.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read another definition. So, internalized racist superiority. So we've talked about internalized racist oppression. We've talked about internalized racist inferiority. Now let's turn to racialized race or internalized racist superiority. Again, it's a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches who white people to believe, accept, and live out superior societal definitions of self, and to fit into and live out superior societal roles. These behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, which is white supremacy culture. So if you're comparing and contrasting, you see the internalized racist inferiority, or for the BIPOC people, in this internalized racist superiority is the process wherein white people are taught to believe that they are superior, better, and it continues to perpetuate. So when we ask the question about dismantling this thing, this monster, how do we do this? And I want to first start talking about how do we do this as people of color, BIPOC people? How do we do that work? And then how do we assist the others in doing their work? Cecilia, you want to go first?
I would like for us to consider that we don't have to assist others in doing their work. I would like for us to consider that the self-work is revolutionary and transformative for us to do it within ourselves. And that there are those of us who it is our job to do that with other people. But it is not, I'm not doing that with folks who I'm not either in deep relationship with, or people that are not paying me for that skill set and that tool. And I think that that's one of the things that we as people of color must get to the point where we recognize that we're healing and we are doing the things that we need to do for ourselves as an act of transformation, healing justice for ourselves, to be able to recognize I need to do this for me, no matter if white folks don't ever do it for themselves. And I think that that is the rub. because we've been socialized to feel like we always have to be taking care of those who perceive themselves to be superior. And we have to interrupt that inclination. I believe everyone on this call tries to interrupt that inclination with love. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. But no buts. And I feel like that should always be the aim. But I think one of the things that even happens with those of us who are people of color, Katina, is that we have so been taught to be thinking about what's happening on the other side. The grass has got to be greener on the other side. The sugar's got to be sweeter. All of those things are so much better on the other side that we're so focused on the other side. I'm doing this because the other side is doing that. What if we gave ourselves permission to do this because we deserve it, because we need to get past this trauma, because we love ourselves, we care about ourselves, and because we need to heal? So,
Dr. Price?
You know, sometimes it's helpful for me to hear like a real life practical example, like something simple to help. It helps me understand it. And so sometimes I feel like it helps other people understand it. When I decided to shift from doing leadership coaching by itself and say, okay, I'm going to focus my part in making this better for the world is to really dig in and say, I'm good at this. Let me help people understand equity and inclusion better. Well, I started out working in the same way that I was before. 5 days a week, 50 hours, if somebody needed me on the weekends, I was doing it. What I came to see was that my spirit takes a beating doing this work, and I can't do it at that rate and at that level. So there are people who probably take offense to what I'm about to say, but this is for my self-preservation so that every Monday I can get up and do the work. I do not work on Fridays or Saturdays or Sundays. And on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, I'm not going to all white spaces, not for anything. I need to rejuvenate my spirit. And so I have friends who might want to go to the Country Club Plaza on a Friday night, and they don't understand why I'm like, well, I'll meet you at Nieces if you want. Because for me, the service at Nieces is good, and they know my name. They pour into me, and it prepares me. It's almost like church prepares me to get up on Monday and do it all again. But why would I go to a place where I know I'm going to be hit with subtle little microaggressions? Like, do you have a reservation? And that look of, I don't know if you can afford to be here, or, just, what I'm talking about, that dance we do because the hostess, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with being a hostess, but a white hostess at a restaurant is treating me as if she was superior to me based on skin color. And so I remove myself from those opportunities for that to happen to me for 3 days out of my 7-day week. And that is how I rejuvenate. And Cecilia, I got to tell you, that is an act, a revolutionary act, because there are people who will, they want to take the front. I mean, why you can't take a session on a Friday night just for an hour? Just no. Mm-mm. We have a right to heal, and that's a privilege. And me saying that out loud is me telling myself that it is okay to do it.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. Edgar, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, this is where therapy is like super critical to this work. And if you're doing some of this work in any shape or fashion, like if you haven't invested in therapy, I highly recommend that, we figure that out together, because therapy is where it's at when it comes to these conversations. Dr. Price, you are what you said is like you established a boundary. And I think that that is one of the hardest things for people to do is establish boundaries, right? Because for me, I suck at boundaries. I suck at establishing boundaries because I'm trying to do the work. I'm trying to do good work and I want to be helpful to people. And I have, like I'm motivated by this work. I want to make sure that there's a difference. I want to make sure there's an impact. Like I want to make sure that people have positive experiences. I want to consider like the trauma that we all go through and reliving these conversations day in and day out. Like I want to be thoughtful in partnerships and relationships and all these other things. And in doing that, I don't establish boundaries. And so I don't have the time to, I haven't created the time to rejuvenate. I haven't had the time to think about it. And some people will gaslight you into thinking like that's a bad thing and a bad decision, right? Like you're not down for the cause, or you're not down for this or this and this. And so what you're encouraging me to think about is like being comfortable with your boundaries, holding space for yourself, and then knowing that if you can't do the work, there are other people doing the work. They may not be as good as you, or they may not be, like they may not have the expertise or the experience or whatever, but they're doing the work. And sometimes that's good enough. Right. So no, also like therapy teaches you a couple of things, which is like, you can only control your actions. You can't control the actions of anybody else. You can only control your emotions. You can't control everybody else's emotions. And so I think that that's the hardest part of the work is like the self-control. And acknowledging how you feel, holding space for your feelings, holding space for the boundaries. And that's critical in doing this work well. So I'm encouraged by your example. And I also think like, I got to readjust and think about where my boundaries are, and holding boundaries is an act of revolution as well.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who has joined us this evening. I want to be respectful of our panelists' time and to get our boundaries, right? Keep our boundaries intact and in place. So this is just a precursor to a workshop that will be presented on May 18th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. I don't know how in the world 90 minutes is going to be enough. So we are possibly going to do a series of these. I just can't imagine that we would not, right? So call your friends, call your neighbors, call your associates, your colleagues. Hey, even call the people you don't really care about that much. You're like, oh, Lord, I hate to be in community with them. Call them too. All of us need to do this work around internalized racial oppression, how we show up in space, how we interact and engage with one another. So again, that's on May 18th from 6 to 7:30. Title, Self-Transformation, You and You, Understanding Internalized Racial Oppression. I'm so excited to be an attendee at that. And in your chat, you will see the link to register for that workshop. I believe there's some other announcements. So, Edgar, I want to first ask you what is coming up for the Latinx Education Collaborative, or any of your partners that people need to be aware of?
Actually, I'll take this opportunity to shout out the Block, because they are doing their conference Liberated this weekend. And so we're happy to be a sponsor of the conference. And so I think they're having a kickoff event tomorrow night, and then some sessions on Saturday. So if you haven't heard about it, or if you have some time, I highly encourage you to support and learn from our Black male educator brothers in this work. So we always have something going on at the LEC. And so, I can't speak to it right now because my brain is turning off. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you so much, Edgar. I will also remind people that every Monday at 5:00 p.m. Central Standard Time, the Coalition Speaks Change in Education is a Facebook Live broadcast put on by the Latinx Education Collaborative, Elements of Education, Kansas City, Just Systems, The Block. So join us, Facebook Live, every Monday at 5:00 p.m. Central Standard Time. Cecilia, do you have anything coming up that you'd like to announce or to share with those that have joined us this evening?
No, you shared already about our workshop that Dr. Price and I are going to be doing on the 18th. I put it in the chat, but I'd also like to focus. All are welcome, and BIPOC voices will be centered, right? Because this is a space for internal racialized inferiority and how we work through it. And this is something we're doing for ourselves. All are welcome, and BIPOC voices will be centered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Nicole Price. What is happening with the Lively Paradox or yourself in regards to book publishing or events or anything that you'd like to share?
I'm excited about the session that Cecilia and I are doing on the 18th, but tomorrow morning it's going to be lit on my Facebook Live at 8 a.m. Central. So y'all make sure y'all show up.
All right. All right. This Filter Free Friday.
It is Filter Free Friday.
Oh,
And I got a lot to say.
it.
I got a lot to say about internalized racial inferiority.
Dr. Price, I didn't think you worked on Friday.
Well, that's not work. That's my release.
Oh.
My Filter Free Friday that's not work. That brings in zero money. Just brings in fans.
It's her joy time. It's joy.
It is joy. It's also real talk. It's like the realest of the real, Nicole.
Well, I again want to thank Mr. Edgar Palacios, my brother, Dr. Nicole Price, my sister, and Mrs. Cecilia Belser-Patton of Just Systems, my other sister. I am your moderator for the evening, or I was your moderator for the evening. My name is Katina Taylor. Just again, we thank you all for joining us. Remember that this will be live and be there so you can go back and review it. I will encourage Edgar, Nicole, and Cecilia. There were some people that posted some questions in the chat. So if you have an opportunity to go back through and look at those questions, and you as our audience members will receive some type of response to those questions. I always want to ensure that that happens so we don't leave you hanging when we have these robust, meaty conversations. So again, thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you all soon. Have a great evening. Rest well.